Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Richard Oxenberg. Richard received his PhD in philosophy from Emory University in 2002 with a concentration in ethics and philosophy of religion. He has taught philosophy and general humanities at Boston University, Salem State University, and Emerson College. He currently at Endicott College in Beverley, Massachusetts. His book, of Human Being, Heidegger and the Bible in Dialogue, was published by Political Press in 2018. Richard specialized in theology, phenomenology, hermeneutics, ancient philosophy, ontology, and applied ethics. He has also entitled Why Evolutionary Theory Contradicts Materialism, published by the Essentia Foundation, the subject of which we will be discussing. Now, so far I've been defending idealism using philosophy and mentioning observations made in the fields of physics and neuroscience, which stand for idealist metaphysics. But I have not covered evolution and how it contradicts materialism. But you seem to be the best person suited for this, Richard. Now, we know that evolutionary theory doesn't explain consciousness. Even Dawkins would admit that consciousness is an absolute mystery in the realm of evolutionary biology. You go one step. Yeah, can you hear me? You go one step to say that it outright contradicts materialism. In fact, you base your argument on observations made within evolutionary theory to show that subjective states have causal powers, and that evolution accounts for the physical. I mean, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah. Let me just, Orlando. I don't know. Your voice is breaking up a little bit, as I'm hearing it. I don't know if that's happening on your end or on my end, but
that's strange.
Yeah. But if it's okay, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I can respond to it. I'm just wondering if it's all getting recorded.
Yeah, it should be. Does it say record on your end? It says recording.
Yes, it does. Yeah. So okay, so we'll just continue with this.
Up a little bit. I mean, I'll see if I can edit some bits out, but I really want to get your take. I want to get most of it. There won't be much editing, if any,
Sure.
to be honest. So
well,
yeah,
let me just, where I thought we might begin with this whole thing is to talk a little bit about, what motivated my writing the article, and what the basic issue of the article was. In many ways, what I'm trying to say is something that we all experience all the time. Very commonly. I mean, in other words, I'm just arguing for something that is a matter of common experience, which is that our mind states affect our behavior. I mean, this is something that happens that we just understand all the time, right? In other words, you feel cold, and the feeling of cold, the sensation of cold, is a state of consciousness. And in response to that state, you go and get a jacket and put it on, and that's behavior. So the mind state of feeling cold is motivating, is causing the behavior of the body to go get a jacket and put it on. And as I say, this is common experience. It's a matter of common sense. It's something we experience every day, all the time. I'm sorry?
Yeah, the whole process, experiencing something caused by something else, implies intention. We feel cold, and then we want to feel warm, so then we act upon it.
Yeah. Well, the way that I would put it is, and what we know of minds, and we know it through our own introspection, is that they operate teleologically, which is what you mean by intention, right? They operate teleologically. That is to say, they are goal-driven. You're getting cold. That creates the goal to feel warm And so, the way that it's just a common sense understanding, the way that we understand it is that our mind, which has the goal of warming us up, causes our body somehow to move and to satisfy that goal. And the problem here is that the body, of course, is matter, right? The body is made of matter. So if we understand this in terms of our basic common sense experience, we have an instance of mind affecting matter, mind causing matter to do what it does. And if mind causes matter to do what it does, and causes matter to do what it does from teleological motives, then that in and of itself defeats the philosophy of metaphysical materialism.
Right.
Right. And so, metaphysical materialism is really completely counterintuitive. It's just counterintuitive to our basic, common, everyday experience. Now, the problem comes in. Oh, go ahead. Did you have
I was going to say, basically, Darwin, he obviously wrote on the origin of species, and it's a bit of a misnomer, and it causes confusion, doesn't it? Like origin implies that it's explaining where life comes from or how life comes about, but really it's just describing the processes and natural selection. But it doesn't actually, the name origin implies that it's about to describe abiogenesis. Now, we know that natural selection isn't random per se. There's a selection going on there, a natural selection. But abiogenesis seems to be, they tend to say it's, it comes about randomly. Certain pressures beget the replicator molecules, and then it gives rise to more complex, things, life forms. I was going to say, is there a teleological principle behind abiogenesis before evolution gets started? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Are you asking me what my thoughts metaphysically are, or what would be true of the theory of evolution as I understand it? Because what I understand.
Yeah.
What that? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Just your thoughts in general. Not just about evolution, but what precedes evolution itself. What precedes life? The very cause and effect process that leads to abiogenesis. Would you say there's a teleological principle behind it, like an intention for nature to go there?
Well, if you're asking my personal view on this, that's the direction that I go in. I mean, that of course is a very kind of anti-modernistic way of looking at things, because what happened in the 17th century with the scientific revolution, is that there was more and more of an attempt to understand reality in strictly mechanistic terms, right? So the alternative to teleological motion that is driven toward a purpose, is mechanistic motion, right? And mechanistic motion was really defined in a formal way by Newton's first law of motion, which is the law of inertia, which basically says that something will remain in the same condition that it's in unless it is acted upon by an external force. And the basic assumption of metaphysical materialism is that all matter, to the extent that it moves through being forced to move by something external. So it's not moving in order to achieve a goal, it's just being pushed, right? Now, if reality is entirely material, and material operates strictly mechanistically, then that implies that there's no teleology at play in the universe. And of course, that seems to contradict our common experience of having minds that have purposes. Um, um, so what sort of threw a monkey wrench into that basic idea,
Yeah.
I think, was the observation that organic life appeared to be designed for purposes, right? It appeared to operate for purposes, right? So you cut your finger, and all of a sudden your white blood cells go into action, and they create this little Band-Aid, this sort of organic Band-Aid we call a scab, right? And that seems to be for the purpose of preventing the finger from becoming infected. And then underneath the scab, the skin gets rebuilt, and then eventually the scab falls away, and it's all repaired. That seems very much like teleological process. Yeah, it seems like the body is designed to achieve a purpose, which is to promote its own survival and safety and so forth. What Darwin did was to show, at least, or to appear to show, that organic creatures are not designed for any purpose, right? I mean, the Darwinian explanation, as metaphysical materialists tend to interpret it anyway, is that every organic process occurred strictly through accident. That is to say that you've got matter sort of swirling around, forming accidental combinations. And when they happen to form an accidental combination that will tend to endure, then that accidental combination will survive. And at one point, purely accidentally, some of those combinations developed the ability to self-replicate. Right? They didn't self-replicate because that was their aim. That was just another accident that occurred. And but now that they're self-replicating, you've got generations of these self-replicating mechanisms. And I say mechanisms because they're still operating strictly on the basic of mechanistic principles.
That's right. I mean, from observation, evolutionists, they tend to use they have a very poor choice of words to describe what's going on. I've heard before, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard before that Charles Darwin regretted describing the process using the words natural selection. He would have preferred self-preservation. No,
self-preservation tends to have a teleological ring to it, right? Over natural selection. Now, I don't know. I mean, if we really delved into Darwin's mind, whether he thought of this as having a teleological dimension to it. But my paper wasn't so much an argument against Darwin, but against the evolutionary materialists, such as Daniel Dennett, who wrote this book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And the dangerous idea was that Darwin explained organic nature in, according to Dennett, mechanistic terms, and without any appeal to any kind of teleological process. We have similar books by Richard Dawkins, right? He wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker, right? Because and that was a reference to William Paley's argument about that William Paley presented the argument that if you were to we were walking down some deserted beach and were to suddenly run across a watch, right? You picked it up, your natural assumption would be that somebody had to design that watch. And William Paley then made the point that an organic body, a person, is much more complex than a watch. And so by analogy, we would have to assume that some intelligence designed the person.
Yeah.
Uh,
Years ago. And I actually, I remember thinking this is one of the best books I've ever read. You know, the Dawkins one. And I thought that's it. It is explained it. Everything that we think, when we think we see design in nature, it's just an illusion. It's all the blind forces of nature at play. But yeah, you're right in when you say that you're not contradicting evolutionary theory. I mean, you and Dawkins could team up to defend evolution against Christian fundamentalists, for example. But your critique of evolutionary theory, it's not the same as what intelligent design theorists say. Natural selection says that only what confers survival advantage is selected for, right? So, yeah. So you agree with the theory of evolution, just not, you don't agree with Dawkins and Dennett about how far it can go. It doesn't have that much explanatory power as they claim it does.
Right. Well, there are basically 2 points that I tried to make in my article. One is that evolutionary theory does not have the kind of explanatory power that that many people believe or just take for granted that it has. And the other is that if you really think carefully about the logic of natural selection, you see that it implies the very thing that we're talking about at the beginning of our discussion, that the mind has causal efficacy in the physical world. And if the mind has causal efficacy in the physical world, then that defeats the philosophy of metaphysical materialism. And so evolution, far from being a support for metaphysical materialism, actually becomes a defeater of metaphysical materialism. So those are the basic 2 points that I try to make in my article. And I guess I can talk about each one, what the argument is for each one. So the argument that evolutionary theory doesn't have the explanatory power that is sometimes attributed to it is a very simple argument, and that is that there is no theory, there's no evolution does not explain the emergence of organic traits. It simply doesn't. What it explains is why organic traits that have emerged persist from generation to generation. That's the explanation. That's what it explains. But it doesn't explain the emergence of the organic traits itself. The emergence of those organic traits are an unknown. They are generally attributed to random mutation, but random mutation doesn't really mean very much. It just means matter bumping into itself and changing itself accidentally.
That's right.
So when we see an organic creature like a human being, what that tells us is that the universe, the cosmos, being, however we want to refer to it, right, has this extraordinary potentiality of producing us. And it's not evolution that gave it that potentiality. That potentiality has to be intrinsic, has to be inherent to the nature of being itself. That's point number one. And to the extent that we supposed that minds are somehow emerge from this material interactions, then those minds also cannot be attributed to any kind of evolutionary process. It must be an intrinsic potentiality of nature, of being, to be able to generate minds. There's nothing about evolution that explains the fact that we have minds. And since there's nothing about evolution that explains the fact that we have minds, there's really also nothing about evolution that tells us what the fundamental nature of mind is, or what the fundamental potentialities of mind are. Because mind is an ontological reality that is not explained away by evolution. And as a person interested in philosophy of religion, religion is very much concerned with mind, right? That's that with the potentialities of mind. We speak of it as spirituality. There's nothing about evolution that tells us that that the mind's purposes or interests or goals should be restricted to an interest in terrestrial survival. In other words, if minds somehow emerge with interests, which seems to be what we observe just through introspection and observing one another, then there's nothing about evolutionary theory that would tell us that those interests are restricted to terrestrial survival. There's nothing there that would imply that. Those interests are going to be of the nature of mind, and whatever the nature of mind is not ultimately attributable to evolution. So that's number one.
Go ahead if you want to finish. I was just going to say, we've heard Daniel Dennett say that, which I think is absurd, that consciousness is some kind of illusion, and then at the same time, this illusion is somehow an emergent property of matter. But then he argues for materialism, and materialism is supposed to be a form of monism. There's only matter, there's no mind, and that somehow mind is an illusion. So, but then when people say to him, well, if you're going to say that consciousness is an illusion, you're practically saying that consciousness doesn't exist. I mean, obviously, when it comes to anything else about consciousness, if we're talking about objects, we don't conflate illusion with non-existence. If we are looking at an object and we think we're observing something that isn't actually there, that's an illusion, but something exists. But when we're talking about consciousness, we can't say it's an illusion. If we say it's an illusion, then we're practically saying we're not conscious. We just seem like we are, which doesn't make sense. And when people point this out to Daniel Dennett, you're practically saying consciousness doesn't exist. It doesn't make sense. And he just says, oh, people are just confused. But I think he's the one who's confused. So I was going to say, when it comes to, and nobody here is defending intelligent design theorists, but when they say there's explanatory gaps in the theory of evolution, they're often accused of committing the God of the gaps fallacy. Could it be that people of, like Daniel Dennett of his ilk, could it be that they are committing something like the puzzle of the gaps fallacy, in the sense that they are expecting, that they're saying, well, we don't quite know yet exactly what's going on, but the gap will be filled by something that's congruous with our left-brained worldview. It's going to be filled by something that fits in with our materialist worldview, something that fits in with reductionism and everything else. I mean, do you find that's what's going on?
Yeah, no, it very much seems like a tautological argument. We begin with the assumption that all there is matter, and so now we have to interpret everything in such a way as to reinforce our assumption. And so, since consciousness seems not to be matter, we now have to deny consciousness, however absurd that may be to do. Of course, one of the most famous arguments in the history of philosophy is the cogito ergo sum argument of Descartes, which basically says the one thing we can be absolutely certain of is that we are conscious. Because to doubt that you are conscious, which I guess Dennett is doing, requires that you be conscious in order to doubt it, right? Only a conscious being can doubt that it is conscious. So anyone who doubts that they are conscious, by the very fact that they're doubting it, has already proven that they are conscious. And so it seems to require an almost extraordinary, one might almost put it a champion level of self ignorance,
Yeah.
of a failure to reflect upon the inability to reflect in order to try and argue that consciousness is an illusion, because of course, in order for there to be an illusion, there has to be somebody who is having the illusion.
Yeah.
And in order to have an illusion, you have to be conscious of whatever it is you are mistaken about in the illusion. So I honestly just can't make rhyme or reason of what somebody like Dennett, who says that, is really intending to say. I often feel with Dennett is that he's a provocateur, and he likes to make outrageous statements in order to get a reaction. And
I don't know. I think Bernardo Kastrup said something along the lines of, it takes an intellectual like Dennett to really talk himself into that kind of absurdity. They're so clever. It's something along those lines. You have to be that, talk yourself into that absurdity, because most common people just wouldn't do it. They would just see common sense straight away. But I don't know. He's trying to be some kind of maverick.
Well, it's a weird form of dissociation. I mean, you're so invested in your own conceptual bubble that that bubble actually prevents you from being able to engage in the self-reflection that would show that your conclusions are wrong. I mean, you can't. I guess I mean, maybe it's. I mean, I don't even know what to say. Is it possible that Dennett is not conscious, whereas the rest of us are? But if he was not conscious, he probably wouldn't be able to say that he's not conscious. Although ChatGPT can do that.
Yeah.
If you ask ChatGPT, "Are you conscious?" it will tell you that it's not. So I don't know if Dennett is some weird version of artificial intelligence, but I don't see how I could possibly doubt that I myself am conscious, and so it just seems like a completely ludicrous and absurd.
That's right.
Argument, whatever he means by that, unless there's some sort of inner hidden meaning that he's trying to convey that that I'm not grasping.
In fact, your article also argues against epiphenomenalism, and it's funny, as you've pointed out, Daniel Dennett is practically saying he's not conscious. He only seems like he is. But at the same time, he's talking about consciousness, and he wrote a book called Consciousness Explained, which a lot of people, laugh and say, oh, it should be called Consciousness Explained Away, because it's not really addressing the issue. And basically, epiphenomenalism must be false on the basis that, if consciousness doesn't affect the material world, right? If it's just a witness and has no causal power, how can it prompt people to talk about it? In a way, it's kind of influencing the physical world. It would. I mean, do you find that negates epiphenomenalism?
Well, epiphenomenalism is the idea that consciousness is just sort of superfluous, right? It has no, the way that I put it in the article, it has no causal efficacy in the material world. It doesn't do anything. It's just hanging out, as you put it, as a witness. And this leads to the second point of my article, which is that that evolutionary theory, I think, if you really analyze it, contradicts epiphenomenalism, right? And this has to do then with the desire to survive. Right? One of the things that we are aware of is that we have a desire to survive. Often in evolutionary discourse, you hear about the struggle for survival. And the struggle for survival implies a desire to survive. And one question we can raise is what accounts for the desire to survive? Well, we've already talked about the fact that evolutionary theory can't account for anything, right? So the desire to survive must have just suddenly appeared. In the midst of all this material interaction, suddenly there was a desire to survive. But the way that I would understand evolutionary theorists to explain the persistence of the desire to survive is that it gives you a survival advantage, right? So the example that I use in the article is the example of pain, right? Why do we experience pain? What would be the evolutionary explanation for why we experience pain? Well, the clear explanation for that is that pain induces avoidance behavior. Avoidance behavior helps us survive. In other words, what we are avoiding are things that are a threat to our survival. So to the extent that pain induces avoidance behavior and we are avoiding threat to our survival, those creatures, those organisms who are better at avoiding threat to their survival will tend to survive better, and they will win the struggle for survival, and they then so those traits that help them avoid threat to their survival are selected for. So in that way, pain is selected for. I think that's the basic evolutionary explanation. But then the question becomes, if pain is selected for, it can only be because pain is causing the body to behave in certain ways. And if pain, which is a mind state, is causing the body to behave in certain ways, then that defeats epiphenomenalism. That means that mind states are having an effect upon the behavior of the physical body. If mind states are having an effect on the behavior of the physical body, that means that minds have causal efficacy in the material world, and that seems to me to be a refutation of metaphysical materialism. So if we try to use natural selection theory, evolutionary theory, to explain subjective experiences like pain and pleasure and so on, and why they have the associations with survival relevant behavior that they have, once we try to do that, we actually come to recognize that evolutionary theory, the theory of natural selection, is in opposition, is in contravention to the idea of metaphysical materialism. And that's a profound, that seems to me to be a profound conclusion. Once you realize that, then your whole metaphysical understanding of reality undergoes a change. Because now, if you put these two pieces together, that evolution can't explain the emergence of mind, and evolution indicates the causal efficacy of mind, then what the next step in that is to recognize that mind is something fundamental to the nature of being. Mind is teleological. That is to say, if you're trying to avoid pain, that's a goal, and you're acting for the sake of achieving that goal. So mind is teleological. Mind is fundamental to the nature of being. Mind is causally efficacious in reality, and that gives us a very, very different metaphysical picture than metaphysical materialism would give us.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Evolutionary materialism would say that the results can be explained in entirely mechanistic terms. Some even saying that it was once a great boon that brought people together to form communities, but now, basically religion has run its course because it makes people divisive, and there are wars within religions, and it's quite schismatic. But there seems to be something more profound going on about the numinous, right? Is it that I was going to ask you, is it that organized religion today is putting out the wrong message? And, for example, the concept of God in ancient times is different now. For example, now some people tend to take the passages in scripture literally, and then they imagine this God that's supposed to be external and outside the universe, separate from us. Whereas, perhaps the ancient view was that God is everywhere. We're all God. We're basically dissociated from the mind at large, as Castrop would put it, and we're all one mind seen from different perspectives. We're just pure consciousness, basically, and hence the name of God that people tend to say, I am that I am. Have we lost that in today's religion?
Yeah, I think that actually we're regaining it in recent times. I think that it's a very interesting thing to consider, the evolution of religious thought. Up until, and this is just my sense, up until the modern age, up until the modern scientific age, I think there were different levels. First of all, there were different levels of understanding of religion. The common person, and still to this day, tend to think of religion in terms of agents, active agents, who are operating like the gods, or one supreme God who is the agent who is operating. But even within Christianity, you have the idea in Thomas Aquinas that God is something other than that. God is not just some agent. God is the supreme good. God is that toward which we are all naturally drawn. And why are we naturally drawn toward God? Because God is the fullness of being. And we are little sort of limited instances of being who have a fundamental desire, and then here's where teleology comes in, right? We have a fundamental desire to be as fully as possible. Now, on a terrestrial level, that desire plays itself out as the desire to survive. We want to be as fully as possible. I mean, if we think about our experience of death, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, given that we've never died, what is it that we're afraid of when we're afraid of death? In other words, we've never encountered death, so how do we know that there's anything there to be afraid of? And I think that what we do encounter is we encounter separation. We encounter not being able to fully engage in life, being isolated, right? And we associate death with darkness. Darkness is a form of isolation, a form of sensory isolation. You can't see what's going on anymore. You can't be related to everything else. So I think we have this fundamental desire to relate to being as fully as possible. And the dread of death is really the dread of the inability to fully relate. And I think that what drives spirituality, is very much the desire to commune with that which is complete in being, which is we call God, right? We want to be in communion with that which is ontologically complete. And to the extent that we can experience such communion, we feel ourselves to be completed. And I think that that is what underlies religion and spirituality. And then it's that's not such an easy idea to express. And so in religious mythologies, we have that idea expressed symbolically and metaphorically in terms of an individual God who is all powerful and all knowing and all this and all that, right? And that's just a sort of way of trying to indicate what is complete in being. And yes, as you say, that the name that God gives to Moses in Exodus, I am that I am, is for me, it's always struck me as an indication of I am that which is complete in being. I am that which is the full being. And therefore, I am that toward which everything is directed.
Yeah, that's right. Shame that realists tend to say that when we have these experiences, humanists, the mystical, even when we have near-death experiences and we experience our consciousness expanding, we see beings of light, it can have a profound impact on people, and it can change the way people see the world. It's a shame that they dismiss that, and they go as far as to say, well, those experiences are a product of brain chemicals, and basically because they are so profound, because they are so different from our day-to-day experience, religion has even hijacked those experiences to say, well, see, this is evidence for what we're saying, and we're going to control you. Basically they use people's profound experiences in order to control them, and they say it's all a sham. Basically, religion is like an authority that infantilizes people, tells them, well, if you behave, then you'll get to experience those heavenly realms. If you misbehave, then you'll go to hell. So they twist the view to say, well, those experiences have nothing to do with religion. What I'm saying is, it's actually might have influenced religion itself. Those very experiences, obviously, they would precede religion, wouldn't they? And well, it seems to conceptualize things. We form constructs, and we create religion, and then religion will have some wisdom there, even though some of the passages in the Bible can seem contradictory, as they point out. Or, I mean, you're the expert on this, but some of the passages in the Bible, for example, don't align with our liberal values. For example, they point to homophobic passages in the Bible. How do you explain that? Do we have the wrong?
So my own view, my own view is, first of all, that institutional religion can indeed be manipulative, and can indeed and has indeed used this promise of heaven and the threat of hell in order to impose its authority and consolidate its power. I think that has absolutely happened. Religion, as we find it in the world, is very much a mixed bag. And what's interesting when you actually look at the religious scripture is you're constantly seeing within religion itself protests against religion. In other words, we're constantly seeing new religions emerge as protest against old religious forms that have become manipulative and corrupt. We see this among the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, who are protesting against the temple sect of ancient Israel. And the prophets are railing against it. The prophets talk about how you've given yourselves over to this sort of transactional idea of God, where you sacrifice so many animals and God's going to give you rewards, and you've forgotten what is really essential to religion, which is compassion and mercy and justice. So the prophets of the Hebrew Bible are protesting against the religion of their day. And to such a degree, in fact, that they say, and God's going to, it's become somewhat ironic because God's going to then punish you, for manipulating the religion. And then in Christianity, we have Jesus, who is protesting against the religion of the Pharisees. And he's protesting against the religious authorities of his day. And what happens over and over again with this, and this is my view, is that you have people who have deep insights into the fundamental values that underlie spirituality and religion. And those fundamental values, I believe, are what we have always thought of as those fundamental values: the values of love, the values of compassion, the values of mercy, the values of justice. And why are they the fundamental values? Because those are the values that connect us to one another. And to the extent that we are connected to one another, we expand in our being. We transcend our separateness. And that brings us closer to what is fulfilled in being. And so you have these figures, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, Micah, who protest, and Jesus, who protest. And then what happens is that the protests themselves become co-opted by these religious forms, and all of a sudden Jesus is being used as a kind of bludgeon to strike against those who don't believe in Jesus. So now, if you don't believe in Jesus, God's going to send you to hell. And in order to show that you believe in Jesus, you have to come to our church and commit to our institutional teachings. And all of a sudden, the very protest gets co-opted into this corrupt form. Now, why did that happen? Well, it happens for a reason that religion also expresses, and that is because we are detached. We are detached from this, from God, from what is full in being. That detachment, and that is just our existential condition. That detachment gives rise to a great deal of anxiety. And that anxiety itself ends up playing itself out in the form of trying to gain material power, to gain power in the world, so that we can secure our existence. And so now there's this competition for power, and religion, as I say, kind of gets co-opted into that competition, and all of a sudden religion itself is now perverted. Because of this, because to put it in the language of religion itself becomes a vehicle for the sinfulness of human beings, rather than a vehicle for their spiritual realization,
which is ironic.
Which is very ironic and paradoxical. But it happens continuously. And so then what happens, and this is related to this whole story of Daniel Dennett and Dawkins, and materialism, is that in order to escape, in order to try to get out from under the abuses of religion, you get people like Dennett who want to do away with it altogether, right? If we can just completely do away with anything like mind or teleology or anything like that, and interpret reality as strictly based upon mindless material forces, then that itself refutes religion and deprives religion of its authority, and that allows us to escape the sense of oppression we feel from these oppressive religious authorities. And
it seems like they are modern day politics who went a step too far. You know, so like I tend to say that the heretics before, who were fighting against the religion that oppressed them, they wanted to prove their claims wrong, to undermine them. So somehow they came up with this lie that there's no spirit, there's no soul in the world whatsoever. It's all just materials, and it's clockwork. And today they are trying to say that it's all clockwork all the way down, and they continue with that lie. They perpetuate that lie because I mean, sometimes they are political activists. Like, I don't know if you've heard of Matt Dillahunty. They don't want Christian fundamentalists to take over the country,
right.
and with good reason. So they also rely on their materialism, because if the notion of entertaining idealism could make them look weak. Does
right.
that make sense?
Yes. And the problem is, excuse me, it's terribly self-defeating. Because if you can't, if you have no ideals, if you can't justify any moral claims, then on what grounds can you argue against the Christian fundamentalists? Because you have to argue against them on some sort of moral grounds, right?
Yeah.
But if you can't, if your philosophy of life, if your philosophy of reality is such that you can't you can't make any room for moral ideals or moral standards, then on what grounds can you object? On what grounds can you object to the immorality of religion? So it becomes, you talk about being ironic, it becomes highly paradoxical. And and that's one of the reasons why I feel strongly that what we need to do is arrive at just a much more enlightened understanding of spirituality, right? We don't want a spirituality that's going to be oppressive, but we also don't want nihilism that's going to prevent us from appealing to the standards that would require that we be respected, that that people be treated decently. So you want to find some middle ground between the authoritarian oppressiveness of religion and the nihilism that sort of metaphysical materialism would tend to promote.
Yeah. I was going to say, I've looked into Nietzsche, and he said, "Oh, God is dead," and then Carl Jung seemed to admire him, and then he also criticized what Nietzsche said. And Carl Jung has an interesting take on religion, in particular Christianity. Carl Jung seems to say that, you know, if the interpretation is correct, he seems to say that Jesus is a representation of God on earth to experience what it's like to be human, and basically he's sacrificed himself for his own sins against humanity, rather than the narrative that he came down and died for our sins. I mean, how do you view that? Do you think that's nonsense, or?
Well, I think if I can remember, I'm not a great expert on Jung, but I think he wrote a book on Job.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think that may be the book that you're referring to where he speaks about that.
yeah,
What I would say, I mean, what I tend to think is that Jung is circling around something that I tend to believe, but I would put it quite differently. And that is that it's not that God is punishing himself for his sins, but if we understand God as the fullness of being, and we understand ourselves as instances of the being of which God is the fullness, then God is immanent within our own lives, right? God is both transcendent as the fullness of being, but also God is somehow immanent in our own lives. And if God is immanent in our own lives, then that means that God is by that very fact a subject to all the suffering that we're subject to, right? God is actually participating in our suffering, and not only participating in our suffering, but even participating in our sinfulness, in our fallenness, because sinfulness, really, I think, if to understand it properly, is a product, a function of the suffering. It arises out of suffering. It's a response to it, an attempt to undo it. We want to no longer be insecure. We want to no longer be vulnerable. We want to no longer be threatened. And so therefore, we go out into the world to try and conquer it, to try and take it over, to try and put other people under our control so that we will no longer have to suffer. So in a sense, sinfulness is itself a function of suffering. And so God is participating in all of this, and as I have come to interpret it, the image of Jesus on the cross is an image of God's participation in both human suffering and human sinfulness, and so God is there with us. As a matter of fact, in I believe it's the Gospel of Matthew. But it might not be that one, but it's one of them. The name Jesus, which literally means, it's Yeshua in Hebrew or Aramaic, it literally means God saves, right? Is associated with the name Emmanuel, which means God with us. And the way I've come to think of it, and you think, how are the two connected? Well, the idea is that God saves us by being with us, right? Through our entering into communion with God, right? That is the way that we are saved from this alienation. And so Jesus represents, Christ represents God with us. Christ represents, he's the man with whom God is. God fully is, right? So he's God and man. And he participates in all the suffering and all the darkness of the human condition. And that's what we're seeing on the cross. But I guess the great beauty, I think of it as beauty, and the great hope that is offered by that very image is that although God,
sorry,
yeah,
the narrative in the Bible, and he was apparently killing babies and causing trouble, and I tend to imagine the story like a psychological process, like the person is in turmoil and in anguish, and all of a sudden this divine idea, this spark that shows you how to get out of trouble. Could that be? Could that stand for Jesus Christ? Like Christ is showing you a way out of trouble to grace. I mean, maybe I've got the wrong interpretation.
Well, yeah. I mean, as I see it, Christ on the one hand is a revelation, of the human being in full accord with God. So that's the beginning of it, right? He's just the revelation of that. That's what the incarnation is. And in being a revelation of that, he is also, in effect, inviting us to enter into the same state of communion with God that he is in, right? So we are to become as he is. And that's what it, by the way, that's what I understand it to mean when in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, no one comes to the Father but through me. That line has often been used in a very authoritarian way to say, well, you've got to become a member of the church, right? And we control the church. And so you've got to do what we say, right? Yeah. But I think that at a much more profound level, what's being said is that what does it mean to go through me? It means you must become as I am, right? Sure. No one comes to the Father other than through becoming as I am, right? Yeah. And as a matter of fact, preceding that statement is Jesus saying, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me, through being as I am. And I think, the way that I've come to interpret it, God is always there. It's not that God, that we're always, we couldn't exist other than through being supported by that which is ontologically fundamental, which is God, right? But we're not always aware of that because we are sort of enclosed in ourselves. And that self-enclosure tends to lead to a kind of egoistic assertion, which is where all the sin comes from, right? And so at some point, and this is also, I think, represented in the cross, at some point, there has to be a surrender, a giving up of the egoistic attempt to save oneself, to become the basis of one's own existence, because that's what the ego sets out to do. It says, oh my God, I'm not standing on anything, and I'm dependent upon this external world. So I've got to go conquer the external world so as to give myself something to stand on. And so I need to become the basis of my own existence. And the way that I become the basis of my own existence is by becoming as powerful as I possibly can be. But that's an exercise in futility because we can't become the basis of our own existence. And so at some point, you've got to give up that project. You've got to say, hey, I can't be the basis of my own existence. And my belief is that when you truly give up that project, that's when grace appears. It's not that God suddenly rewards you for it. It's that the grace is there in the background all along. It's just that we don't see it because we're involved in this frenetic project of trying to save ourselves. And when we finally give up that project, as Jesus finally does on the cross, right, his very last line on the cross in the Gospel of John is, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit, right? And once again, I think Jesus is an icon here for the human process of entering into true communion with God. That's the way that Jesus says he is. And that is to a kind of surrender to that which is ultimate. And that surrender is at one and the same time a kind of ego death, we might say, but also a resurrection. And so the way it's put in Christianity is that we die to the flesh, which is Paul's word for the ego, right? We die to the flesh and are reborn in the Spirit of God. And that's the ideal. And so that is what I understand is the underlying meaning of Christ's passion. And then it gets, once again, because it gets distorted and it gets turned into believing in Jesus as somebody once put it, is fire insurance, right? In other words, I mean, because hell is full of fire and you don't want to have to be thrown into hell. So if you say you believe in Jesus, then God won't throw you into hell. And that's kind of a distortion of this more profound meaning. That's how I see it.
I mean, the symbolism in those stories is quite powerful, but it seems like the materialists, secular people, when they attack religion, they tend to take it literally. It's easier to take those passages literally to attack it. So, for example, the story of Job, they tend to say, "Oh, how can God be so amoral? How can he have a bet with the devil and do that to Job, who has remained faithful to him?" But then if you see the story from like a symbolic and psychological perspective, Job, even though he's loyal to God and to his values, what it's like a pyramid. If you have like a hierarchy of values, then what sits at the top is God, what you value the most. You can't help but worship that because it's the ultimate example. He remains faithful to that, but he's not human, and he's got an ego, and that ego comes out when things go wrong for him, because the world does what the world does. Things go wrong for him, so he suddenly questions. I've been doing everything right. Why is this happening to me? And God's answer is quite cryptic. But if you take it literally, the atheists will say, "Oh, look, this is the God you worship." He's reprimanding Job for asking the question, but really, Job is coming to a realization. It's happening because the world has been there before you. Why should the world conform to your wishes? Realize that you are part of the world. The world is in constant flux, flowing. And if you go against it, that's your ego, isn't it? So I think it comes to that profound realization. And the story, God says, "Who are you to question me? I've created the foundations of the world," something along those lines. And I think that's Job realizing, well, God is within him, and come to this profound realization and understanding. And once he gets it, then things go okay for him, because now he's free, he's liberated, he knows what's going on. I mean, what's your take? Do you think that's a good take on it?
Yeah, very much. I think that, first of all, I think that in general, you have to be able to read the Bible. I guess we could say it poetically. You have to recognize that it is a poetry of the spirit.
Yeah.
And if you take the poetry too literally, you're just going to miss it. You're just going to miss what it's actually trying to say. You have to interpret the poetry in order to understand what it's getting at. I think that's true in general, and that's not to say. And I also should say I believe that the Bible is itself a flawed, I won't just say fallible, but a flawed spiritual object. It's got all kinds of garbage in it, in addition to all kinds of light. And so you've got to also not only read it poetically, but you've got to read it with discernment. And those are two really important ways of reading it. I think the book of Job is one of the most extraordinary and profound books of the Bible, because what it's tackling is what is called in the philosophy of religion, it's tackling the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? And once again, reading it poetically, right? It starts out as this sort of contest between God and Satan, right? And what is Satan saying to God? Basically, Satan is saying to God, "Hey, nobody can be true to you. Nobody can be true to you," right? And God says, "Well, wait a minute. What do you mean nobody can be true to me? Look at Job. He's true to me. He's such a great guy. He's true to me." And Satan says, "Yeah, he's only true to me, true to you, because you've made everything good for him." right?
Yeah.
Take away all that stuff, and you're going to see he's going to curse you to your face, right?
Yeah.
Because he's not really true to you. He's just true to the goods of the world that you are providing for him, right?
Yeah.
And so, and what that actually represents is a real something that we all encounter, that anybody who lives with faith encounters. That is to say, when bad things happen, right, is that naturally becomes a challenge to our faith in the fundamental goodness of life and the fundamental goodness of reality. So what's happening to Job is just something that happens to everyone. So then God said, well, sure, go ahead, take everything away from him, right? And let's see what happens, right? And and that's just exactly what happens. Everything is taken away from Job. And he is forced to face and to encounter all the suffering that a human being can encounter, right? He loses his wealth, he loses his family, he loses his health, he loses everything, right? Yeah. And finally,
you got to die or something.
What's that?
I think his wife says, God and die or something like that.
Yeah, right. Well, he does. He finally curses the day I was born, right? Curses life. He is on the precipice of losing everything and losing his faith. I mean, he's on the precipice of it. But what he can't, he starts berating God for not being as just as God should be. And in that berating of God, what he's showing is his own commitment to justice, to the idea of justice. He doesn't give up on it. He's saying, God, you're supposed to be just, and this isn't just, right? And he doesn't ever give up on it. But in not giving up on it, now, if we go, once again, we have to read poetically. I mean, what is God? What does God represent in terms of values? God is justice. God is love. God is compassion. God is mercy. So in not giving up on the idea of justice, he is actually maintaining his commitment to God. And God understands this. At the very end of the book of Job, God makes it clear that he sort of understands this. Now, what happens, very interestingly, in the book of Job is that Job's friends come along. And the Job's friends, start to say, you must have done something wrong. You must have done something wrong that God is punishing you for. You must have. And Job keeps saying, I didn't do it. I didn't. And they say, you must have, because God would never do this. But the truth is that God does do it. And that's just the reality that we live in. Bad things happen to good people. All sorts of things happen. And what accounts for that? We don't know. It's a mystery. It's the nature of reality. And because those bad things happen, that leads us to question our faith. As a matter of fact, it's probably the sort of thing that leads Daniel Dennett to want to, get rid of religion altogether. How can you possibly believe in God with all these bad things happening in the world, right? That's just the question of Job. That's the challenge that Job has. But the problem is that you get rid of God, as we were saying before, you seem to get rid of the moral ideals, because there's no longer an ontological basis for those universal moral ideals. So Job never abandons his moral ideals, although he gets angry at God for failing to deliver on them. And then in the end, right, we have this voice from the whirlwind in which God basically says, you don't understand. Now, he says it in a very imperative voice. So it's, there is this sense in which, once again, you can kind of read it two ways. If you read the imperative voice, then it sounds as if God is just trying to intimidate Job into submission, and which is a very unsatisfactory answer. It's not that Job actually ends up having a revived faith in God. It's just that he's so intimidated by God that he, is afraid to say anything. But another way of reading it is that Job comes to see that the reality, for whatever reason, is constructed in such a way that he can't understand it. He doesn't know why there's all this suffering, but there is. But despite all that suffering, what Job sees, and I think this is what you were saying before, is he sees the fundamental goodness of God, right? He sees the fundamental goodness underneath all of that, despite all of that suffering. And it is to that fundamental goodness that he finally commits himself. And then poetically, the way that the story ends is that all the goods are returned to him. But as I read it anyway, that is a kind of metaphorical, poetical way of saying that he has now achieved spiritual riches after having gone through this whole process.
It's really there's nothing you can do about it. So what else is there to be at peace with it? To find acceptance. I think there's something in Buddhism along those lines. To try and find acceptance. It's a similar message, isn't there? And yeah, that's right. And I was going to say, in the context of idealism, so we have our own personal minds, and then we find ourselves in a world that appears to be soulless and gross. The gross reality of material. But I tend to think that it's more like a shared dream. A dream that we all share. Multiple conscious observers sharing a dream world with set rules that we must all abide by, and then there's lessons to be learned, and then we experience things because of the world around us. But then we also have our own, even as what Kastrup would say, altars of this larger mind, the mind of God. Even as associated altars, we manage to have our own private worlds. Like when we dream, we become the gods of our own dreams. I mean, I'm talking from the perspective of a lucid dreamer. I tend to practice lucid dreaming. So if you're having a normal lucid dream, you don't know that you're dreaming. So it's kind of like the dream influences you. So and then you can mistake the dream for being the origin of your own feelings. Going back to the conversation about evolution we were having, they tend to say that in evolution, there's the origins of how you feel and the need, the desire to survive is explained in mechanistic terms. So we look at the world, the shared dream, and we think that world creates us, the consciousness and our minds. So in the context of a personal dream, our own dreams, we tend to think, oh, the dreams are driving us and making us feel a certain way. But I've noticed that when you become lucid in a dream, when you realize that you're dreaming, things change. You feel different. You feel differently about the dream environment, what's around you. And all of a sudden you have a freedom to try and manipulate the dream world, and your potential to control that dream world increases. And you're no longer bound by that. You're not being dictated by that dream. You control the dream. You become potentially you become the god of your own dream world. And when you wake up, once that dream is finished and you wake up, whatever feelings you had inside you persist. They carry on. So they're separate from the image of the dream, the illusion. They're separate. They survive. Your feelings survive, and your consciousness survives. So I tend to think that this is the real world, as they say, is like a larger dream, which is shared by multiple observers. And once you once you die, once it comes to an end, then you kind of wake up to a larger reality, and then you realize, okay, that person that I used to be was only a narrow version of myself. It wasn't really the real me. The real me is pure consciousness. So you kind of wake up and move on. I mean, how do you view? What's your theory of life after death? What happens at death? Because obviously consciousness is something that can't be destroyed. You can't reduce it. It has to carry on. Even experience, when people think that they are really unconscious, the experience is continuous. It never, there are no gaps. You don't perceive any gaps, right? So logic dictates, even though materialists don't like to admit this, logic dictates that the experience is continuous. It goes on. What do you think happens? I mean, do we expand? Do we come back? Like rebirth, like in Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, my quite honestly, I don't have a very robust theory of what happens after death. I'm very aware of what I don't know. um, and I find when we start to speculate metaphysically about the fundamental nature of reality, I find it to be a great mystery. I I I approach it more from the standpoint of what I would call faith than from the standpoint of what I would call any kind of sense of knowing what's going on. And faith in this context means, for me, means trust, means that there's a kind of trust. I think that I believe that there's a fundamental goodness. I believe that that fundamental goodness somehow underlies all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that we see in ordinary life, and that ultimately we are making our way to a realization of that fundamental goodness. And I don't know, beside that, I'm not sure what it is, whether, we die and wake up to a complete awareness of the fundamental goodness, and we begin to realize that that life as we experience it, finite life, is just like going to an amusement park. You can ride on the roller coaster, and you can ride on the merry-go-round, and you can ride on, so now we hang out, for a while in fundamental goodness, and then say, okay, time to go for another ride. And maybe that's it. I don't know. Or maybe some of the spiritual metaphysical ideas that have appealed to me, just because I like them, but I don't know that they're any truer than anything else. Sri Aurobindo, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Sri Aurobindo, who's an Indian thinker, who has an evolutionary theory of spirituality. And basically his idea is God is kind of playing hide and go seek with himself, and breaks himself up into this highly diverse world, and then it's all evolving toward higher and higher levels of unity, and we are on that, in that process, so that we do have some sort of soul that is going to survive our bodies, and that we're going to reincarnate in a life that is going to help us move forward. What we're doing is moving ever forward toward a realization of the completeness, the fullness of being, right, in our individualities, so that we will eventually all be, as I would put it, this isn't Sri Aurobindo, but we would all be Christ-like. That's sort of where we're all headed. And
the Brahman, the drop in the ocean, and basically the drop is the ocean, and the ocean is the drop, and
right,
the drop will realize the ocean eventually.
Except where Aurobindo goes with this is he doesn't say that the drop is going to simply dissolve in the ocean, right? The drop is going to retain its own separate awareness of itself as in relation to the ocean. It's going to know that it's part of the ocean, and it's also going to know that it is an individual that has its own separate integrity. I like that idea.
I like that idea too. So our worldview basically contradicts Kastrup's worldview, because Kastrup seems to say that there's a limit to what the mind at large can experience, because though it's aware of everything, it can't metacognize. There's no metacognition. But
Right.
Aurobindo seems to once let's say the drop realizes it's the ocean, not only does it realize it's the ocean, it also retains a memory of being the drop. So it practically becomes omniscient in a way, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean that's kind of where Aurobindo seems to go with it. And I have tremendous admiration for Bernardo Castro. And I haven't read everything he's written, but I've read a number of his books, and I've watched a number of his videos and so forth. Um, um, and I have a tremendous appreciation for his critique of materialism. When he then goes off into his metaphysical speculations, there are places where I might be inclined not to follow him. He doesn't believe in free will. I tend to believe in free will. He and as far as the idea that consciousness is not metacognitive, has no metacognition at its fundamental level, I don't know. I mean, first of all, I have to say I know that I don't know, but my tendency.
I was going to say, but then again, I can only speak from the perspective of being a human being with my own experiences, because I tend to meditate and explore my own mind. And I'll just say this quickly. Once when I wasn't even trying to, I wasn't even meditating per se. I was using a form of meditation, more like mindfulness meditation, in order to achieve wake-initiated lucid dreaming. So basically, I was lying down, and my exercise was I would focus on an object in my mind, like a light bulb, and every time my mind wandered, and every time I realized my mind had wandered, I would bring it back to the object in my mind, and I did it as many times as it took, very patient with myself. I kept bringing it back to the lamp. And what happened after took me by surprise. I didn't experience lucid dreaming, but I stumbled upon a different state, which was I can only describe it, but my description be the real thing, if you see what I mean. It's like I have a narrative that tries to describe the state, but the narrative is not the state. It's like everything became blank. There were no concepts, no thinking, no memories, nothing. But I was in a state of bliss, and it was like a peaceful stillness, and it was like a revelation, like an epiphany in a way. I became aware of my true self, who I really was, like I was looking at awareness itself, awareness of awareness, which is why I found it dubious. I know Kastrup is very humble in saying I have my own theories, but I don't have a theory of everything. I'm not saying this is definitely the truth. But yeah, that experience, I still remember it. And it actually happened before I even discovered Kastrup. And when Kastrup said that mind at large isn't metacognitive, it made me think, hold on a minute. I experienced a state practically divorced from conceptual reality. There were no concepts. I was in that stillness, and it was it was bliss, and it was like a radiant emptiness, like luminous, but not light. I can't describe it. It was like a feeling, and then thinking came to me, and the first, well, it's almost like I had a revelation, but then I tried to conceptualize it. So the thoughts came to me, and the first thoughts were, what is this? Where am I? Who am I? And then it began to form a narrative of what I was experiencing. But then as the thinking began to flood my field of awareness, I lost that pristine, blissful cognition. So the more I began to build a story, the more I lost it. And then I began to identify with the narrative. And before I knew it, the bliss was gone, and the thoughts felt like they were weighing on me. And then I was back to normal and back to my restricted self. Does that make sense? I mean,
Well, yeah, and that's an extraordinary story. And yes, it makes sense to me. Because what I would say, I've never had such an extraordinary experience. I've had intimations of it. It's the best I can say. But yes, that very much corresponds to the way I sort of envision things. That there is this, what I would call this fullness of being, and it seems as if you tapped into that in some profound way at that point.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, I don't know how this works, but I guess I imagine that in a way, what makes bliss blissful is that it is in contrast to what is not blissful. And bliss would not be as blissful if you were always in bliss. And in some ways, the bliss sort of then breaks itself up. The bliss is a great sense of unity, a great unity. Then it breaks itself up into the great diversity of the world that we experience. And you kind of seem to be coming back down into your own individual self. And with this memory.
Yeah, it reminds me of the principle of polarity in Hermeticism. I don't know if you're aware of the stuff that Stephen Wallard is doing in his Hermetic Idealism group on Facebook. He basically, there are these principles. It's like a spectrum, and then you get opposites. And in order to really realize one end of the spectrum, you have to understand the opposite end of the spectrum. So it's almost like in order to really see the light in its full manifestation, you have to experience the darkness,
Yeah.
And of the abyss stares back at you, but if you continue to stare at the abyss and you really experience the darkness, then you begin to understand the light, because the light becomes more pronounced, more obvious.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
And it is, and I think there does come a time, at least, I believe, when you can, even if you find yourself in the darkness, you can trust that, the light is still there. The light is still underlying that darkness. And that's, that's a kind of very redemptive experience. And so then you go back into the world, but you go back into the world in a much more redeemed way. And that's when, you become a vehicle of love, of compassion, and so forth. And that, I think, is what we mean by saints. I'm far from that, but that anyway would be the ideal. By the way, Arlindo, you're frozen on my screen. I don't know if I'm frozen on yours. I guess not. I can hear your voice, but but somehow it's
See, I can see you're fine. You're fine. Maybe it's just my end. I
I
was
don't
going to
know.
say, I really appreciate your agnosticism and your honesty. And obviously, nobody knows what's going to come once we shuffle off our mortal coil. Um, but I do like to explore the mind and different altered states of consciousness, because I think that it might give us a glimpse or glimpses of what's to come. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I used to in my 20s, I used to experiment with psychedelics, and I remember taking magic mushrooms once, and I tripped for like 9 hours, and I remember at one point there was a moment. It's like a brief moment where I became euphoric, and it felt like my mind became the world,
Hmm.
and I felt like I was some kind of god that had created everything for my own amusement. And then I was looking at the trees, and the trees looked like giant broccolis. And then it's like a weird epiphany, but it wasn't delusional. And then it suddenly finished, and I went on to just look at patterns and visual distortions and stuff. But I was still tripping, and I was thinking, what the hell was that? What did just happen? It felt like I remembered something about reality, and then I lost it. But literally, in that moment, when I felt like I was some kind of god that had created things for my, I became euphoric. I was laughing like, ah, ah, ah. It was like a circus all around me. And then all of a sudden it stopped. It's like my consciousness became narrower again. And then I was back to being myself. So, it just makes me think, was that a glimpse of something greater or something that I've forgotten, you know?
Yeah.
And I've also noticed people who experience NDEs, they obviously, it's a completely different experience. They experience trauma, severe physical trauma, and then they have those mystical experiences. And I've noticed many of them, the people seem to describe like an all-loving light. And it just makes me think, is that like a revelation, like I don't know, like something greater than us, which we are a part of, but you know, perhaps could call that God. I don't know. It's all mixed, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I many years ago, I had an experience that was somewhat comparable to that. It didn't involve drugs, but I was lying in my bed, and for some reason, I just wanted, I started asking myself where my thoughts are coming from. What is, where are the thoughts coming from? What is actually underneath the thoughts that are causing the thoughts? And I started entering into this sort of contemplative attempt to get underneath my thoughts. And at some point, I got into this mode of what I could simply call a kind of expansion, what felt like this great expansion of consciousness that did not involve any thoughts. And I was just large. It was peaceful. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was incredibly blissful, but it was very peaceful, and I liked it. Kind of, and then I was in that for a while. Then all of a sudden, it was like my mind narrowed itself back down to a point, right? After it had expanded, it sort of narrowed it back down to a point, and then I was back to myself. And it was
Yeah.
just a sense that my mind, my finite mind is a kind of a point, a retraction of this more infinite thing that is sort of there in the background.
It's very interesting. And I wonder if it becomes more pronounced once we, once we pass away, if that thing becomes more pronounced. But who knows? Maybe it's different for all of us. But then we go to to the same source, and
Yeah.
God knows.
Yeah. Well, Lindo, I'm going to have to move on because I have an appointment that I'm going to have to go to. But this has been great. I've really appreciated having this talk with you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and
Yeah.
maybe we can do some other time
I'd love to do some more. We'll see how this comes out. I'm hoping, because as I say, your voice on my end has been breaking up a little bit. So I'm just hoping the recording, is good. I guess we'll see. But it certainly has been a very provocative discussion.
That's right. I was going to say, I'm quite happy to release this maybe tomorrow and edit it. I mean, are you okay with that? Or
yeah, I mean, would you mind sending me a copy of it before, or letting me just have a view of it before you make it public? I'd appreciate that if I could.
Yeah, no, definitely. Just let me know if it's okay, or if you'd like me to edit some things, or to make it clear.
Okay.
I don't know if my it's distorted or something. I don't know. Maybe we can edit that out.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Your picture is perfectly fine. You're moving around and talking. Mine seems fine, but maybe I don't know how the whole thing's going to come out, but we'll see. I'll definitely send you a copy.
Oh, great.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Orlando.
Thanks a lot.
Very good. Wonderful talking to you. And be well.
Good weekend. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.